All right. So I'm talking with Chetan today, negative pragmatism. We've definitely had multiple conversations through the net, but I finally get to talk with you one-on-one, Chetan. So you've raised some concerns, and I guess I want to just like uh, figure out exactly what those concerns are and the questions that you bring out here. Um, yeah, so let's start there. What is your immediate concerns with lack, your understanding of it, and the Lacanian notion of lack? Is there something missing
Okay.
in that?
Is it something missing, like any notion of lack? Is that what you
Yeah, yeah. Is there something that is there something missing in when we talk about lack that we need to understand from the
saw?
psychoanalytic point of view?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Javier. Just sort of maybe mentioning it here for anybody who will be listening later on. I love the reading groups that we used to do. Me and Jyoti still talk about those reading groups till today. The ones we are doing on. Yeah. So with Dawood and Joaquin and
Hmm.
yeah. So yeah. So lack, I think, it very easily gets misunderstood in our discussions, and not even in academic literature. Because if you think about lack has a connotation, and even Deleuze, when he's sort of responding to Hegel's problem of, say, or even Lacan in that sense, in his writings, he says that Nietzsche is a yes to Hegel's no. That's the starting question within this Deleuze Hegel struggle through Nietzsche in that sense, and Nietzsche Hegel binary sort of where it emerges from. Lacanian notion of lack is extremely interesting because it cuts through this yes and no problem in some senses. And what is that problem? We can have a longer discussion upon it. That what does it mean to say that Hegel has a no over there and Nietzsche has a yes over there? At what point we can think about that? And usually that distinction also comes through this binary between reactive and active forces. Isn't it? That the no side lies on the side of the reactive and the yes lies on the active. Lacan's question is extremely interesting. Think about it would be to this problem of non-relation, where Lacan argues that there is a fundamental non-relation in all relationships that you see around yourself. And the heart of all relationships lies this question of sexual relationship, that there is no fundamental sexual relationship possible. So there is no ideal relationship between man and woman possible, for instance, or there's no ideal relationship between nation and citizen possible, or whatever, such. And this fundamental non-relation, this is not simply absence of relation. This is non-relation, non-word has to be thought through over there. That this non-relation, far from it being a, a, a site of, in some senses, resentment or loss in that sense. For Lacan, that is immediately simultaneously also the creative site. That is where it becomes possible for us to, um, you know, um, have the relationships the way we want them to have it. That is where, in something, subject emerges, subject's desire emerges, subject's own able to reorient his own drives emerges. All of those questions of creativity emerges from that non-relationship. And unless we affirm that site of non-relationship to the end, we cannot affirm the site of that creativity. And that's the problem of lack in Lacanian thinking, which is why another way to think about lack becomes that lack is not zero. It's never zero. If it's zero, then it's simply a no. It's simply something whose loss we need to, in some senses, we need to look at it simply as a loss. There's nothing else possible with it. There is a minus one over there. There is something which is structuring um, that loss at the level of form. There is there's something happening at the level of form that restructures and that gives that negation a creative dimension. And how do we think through that problem? We can have longer discussions, but yeah, I'll just maybe.
Okay, so what I'm gathering is the Lacanian notion of lack is this understanding that this idea of non-relation, and non-relation is another way of saying that there is really no ideal relations. Not that there's absence of relations, but no ideal relations. And so in some sense, we're already in a state of lack. But the question is, how do we move from perhaps from understanding, it's funny because some people probably don't even realize that we're making ideals of relations, right? That this is the issue. But then the construction of these ideals of relations that are taken as real relations, the loss of them is this assumption that there will then be an absence of relation, which is interesting. So even moving from here and this paradigm, getting people to move from this understanding that really there is a non-relation, or fundamentally that relations themselves are lacking. And it's the lack that lacks that allows this kind of understanding to happen, or be the side of creativity that you're talking about. Yeah, so I guess yeah, this question of zero is interesting. I know Jochen has, I don't know if he takes zero as a no. I'm not sure. But yeah, this -1, I get the understanding of your -1 when it's, because the way I would look at the -1, the way you describe it is because it's lack, it's always lacking. Like it undermines itself. And so in some sense, it's always going to be a -1, right? It has to continue to be this kind of site or non-relation that allows. Now, my next question that I was thinking about for your question about passive and active was that I was actually thinking that lack, I don't know if it's the same. I wouldn't say it's the same, but I think it functions very similar in terms of entropy. What do you think about that? That lack might actually function something like entropy.
So, when you say lack functions like an entropy, so you're saying that it increases the entropy in that sense? How do you think about it?
The way I think about it is that I was trying to make sense of surprises. Why surprises happen. And my speculation is that because if lack functions like entropy, then it means that lack accumulates. When it continues to go in a sort of unnoticed or unmaintained direction. You're not ordering it. So the more that you don't order it, it accumulates and then a surprise happens, right? You took the lack as an absence. So it continues to accumulate into an event or a surprise. That's what I was thinking on a speculative level, that maybe lack kind of functions as a kind of has a kind of entropy to it. I don't know if it functions exactly like entropy, but I had this, idea that maybe it does. Especially with just like material things and everything. I mean, you have to maintain things. Um, material and some materials are in a state of privation precisely because they are finite, and so you have to maintain them. And without maintaining them, you either surprise yourself with why they don't work, or you surprise yourself when they explode or something like that. I mean, it's these are very small scale kind of examples, but yeah, I mean, I was thinking that's how I was thinking about it in that sense.
Hmm. Um, Entropy actually is a very interesting problem. Maybe let's maybe try and um, confine it to certain uh, useful conceptual
Mhm.
tools to it. So entropy is Arnold Schwarzenegger has a very interesting book called What is Life?
Okay.
where he sort of develops this idea of entropy in connection to thinking around questions of life in that sense. And fundamentally, he's asking this problem that if second law of thermodynamics, in some senses, always talks about this problem, any system left to itself maximizes entropy in that, um, that's a structured issue. And he's talking about, and how does life reverse this process?
Mm.
Something about it. Of course, one immediate sort of outcome of this problem has always been what Hegelian insight was always, in that sense, that this means that the world we live in is ontologically not a closed system, it's an open system.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Because if a closed system, entropy would maximize and it would get over.
Mm-hmm.
You know? The other sort of consequence of this is that this openness, this open system is fundamentally connected to, in some ways, uh, questions of what we may call, in our thinking, called life in that sense. That life is something that makes the system fundamentally open. You can find parallels to this kind of a thinking, in different forms emerging. Questions of unconscious is very similar in that sense, in the psychoanalytic zone, unconscious structure like a language. It's very similar insight. Second is that entropy is a function of the useful energy of a system. Entropy maximizes, the system doesn't have any useful energy left for it to do work. That's what this maximization of entropy is. And which is why life is interesting, because life can actually, in some sense, accumulate forms of energy in a manner that some useful work can be done from it. Which is why what you come out with a concept called negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy.
Okay.
And negentropy is not simply, as Bernard Stiegler, very famous philosopher, would talk about, and I've written a paper for Cadell's anthology where I sort of discuss this at length, where negentropy is not simply opposite of entropy, which is not possible. Entropy cannot be reversed in any human systems in that sense. But negentropy is a slowing down of the entropic process.
Okay.
As you slow down the entropic process, then you can immediately find the parallel between entropy and dead drive. Very similar insight, as you in Freudian thinking, there's no life drive as such, so there's no negentropy. Life sort of comes from this divergence that dead drive can take, this longer routes that dead drive can take, right? So similarly, entropy also finds its relationship with negentropy when we slow down the process of entropy, when we can create new ways of a system reaching its, in that sense, entropic end, you may call that. And that is where the creative side sort of exists. I think that's the first maybe background we can lay for the problem you are, in some senses, charting for, in that sense. Uh, that negentropy is slowness of entropy. It demands the system taking routes which have not been taken before, in some sense, in that sense. Because if a system is simply repeating what it has in the, simply forming itself on some rule-based apparatus, it will maximize its entropy, which is where a question of surprise comes into place. Because it is only through system encountering something it has not encountered before that the entropic process slows down sufficiently.
Mm.
Otherwise, entropy maximizes immediately, which is why when system sort of structure gets too structured, it loses its capacity it loses link to life, if you may call it, its relationship to life. It starts acting like a dead mechanical,
Mm-hmm.
site. It's only when a system starts encountering things which are truly contingent. It
Truly
starts
contingent?
it starts developing a relationship with that, with what you may call a surprise, with event, and we can have those discussions. That a system starts developing its own negentropic potential. Uh, am I making?
No, yeah. No, no. Let me recap to make
Please,
sure I understood.
please.
So you're basically saying that uh this word negentropy
Yeah.
um is something that is not opposite to entropy, but it's a way of slowing down the entropic process. Okay. So if the entropy is always trying to maximize, you're pointing at that there's certain structures that we have that are so calculative that of course the entropy will maximize it. The question is, because it then becomes dead, like you talk about, the question is now, how do we deal with this kind of this space between a dead calculation or a dead mechanism and the rest of the entropic process. And you can say this is the side of creativity that you're probably looking for, right? And I guess you could say this is where I would like negative pragmatism to be, as a kind of slowing down process. And it's very hard to think in terms of strict contingencies. Yeah, I guess I would ask you, how would you think about this in relation to just contingencies? Are we thinking what we do with, for example, like something that is useless, right? Would we say that the mistake with uselessness is this idea that actually uselessness itself has energy? It can be used actually, but the question is, it cannot be used the way that we think it can be used. We have to think about other ways to use it. The question is how, and I guess this would be the negative pragmatic question. And I'm curious what you think about that process. Like, is there an answer to this in Lacan, Hegel, or in your own thinking on this?
So let's maybe start from where we in that sense, you brought us in very nicely to this point that if you think about this, that the system when it becomes too calculative, when it makes the other too predictable, the system reaches its equilibrium with this environment, which is what maximization of entropy is all about. Am I right? And maximization of entropy is when an organism reaches a complete stability with its own environment. It's only when there is certain instability left between the environment and the organism that some work remains possible. So let's place it at that point where some useful energy remains possible. So entropy immediately can be thought of this equilibrium with the environment. You're using the word dead. We may continue with that word, but that word needs a lot of unpacking. So you may just think about the undead also over there. So I'm just leaving that out there. That might need a lot of unpacking in that space, but let's just leave it for now. And use that word as a useful word to communicate within this discourse. So when a system reaches its end or it reaches its death, as you say, we can immediately see that when we're talking about use itself lies on the side of the predictable other. Am I right? When we can use something, we are immediately having a certain idea for what something will be used in that sense. So it is relying on the lines of predictability, this calculation, which is why, if you notice in human sphere, cultural objects be useless.
Say that again?
If you think cultural objects. So what is the use of Taj Mahal? Isn't it?
Good point.
So when you want to find this beauty in that sense is never immediately useful. If you think about it. For instance, let me just give you an example. So I don't remember the names. I'm just sort of throwing it off. If you want, I can use much more detail. But many useful mathematical theorems which found great uses. For instance, there was a mathematical sort of insight which came into quantum gravity. When they were first discovered, they had no use in their current times. Most mathematicians sort of went after those mathematical insights because they were beautiful, not because they were useful.
Yeah.
It's only because they pursued something precisely for its own beauty that it found great uses later on in this world. Very practically put, how does this happen? Why does it happen like this? If you ask that question fundamentally, you will realize that that use itself sort of instrumental and useful things have their own purpose in human world, but it instrumentalizes something to the extent that when we only look for what something can be used for, we again immediately reach in an equilibrium with the environment. We maybe maximize the entropy in that sense.
Hmm.
There's nothing else possible there. So useless is a very important marker for life to exist. Life has to move through mediums which are structured through the useless category in that sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
One of the things, how do we think about that problem and that structure of life, which is why life always, in some senses, finds ways of, it's characterized by drive in that sense in the Lacanian thinking, something that circulates the object but never reaches it.
Hmm. Hmm.
The question of the drive in that way. If you think about human, the civilizations and cultures largely, humans have always aspired to do things which haven't been immediately useful for them.
Yeah.
You know? Uh,
Hmm.
what is it about that question that we need to further unpack for to maybe think about what you're asking us to think about? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in popular culture, you could say that we already, just by looking at like science fiction and all this, and like horror films, you can tell that even horror films and apocalyptic films are predicated on surviving. There's there everything has to be useful. This is this is what's interesting about our culture now is that even apocalypses has to be useful, right? We have to survive. Um, and in that sense, the theme doesn't change, actually. That you must survive and it has to be useful. Um, and so in some sense, you could say media culture has already predicted where calculation gets us. And then yet it would say that we would repeat it again. Like, I mean, that's what's so interesting about what you're bringing up. And another thing that you brought to mind is this idea of culture. Because then now we're at this problem where we're trying to think plurality, pluralism, what to do with that. Um, but that is always confined within the sense of what is a plurality that is useful to everybody. Now it would be hard to think actually of a plurality that actually would not be fixated on usefulness, but something like beauty. What would that look like? Is something that I wouldn't even know where to begin because I think on a small scale, I see, the problem that I see is this culture of what I would call optimization, but they're doing the same things that you could see that it would be similar behavior for the sake of beauty, you could say. But it's not. It's for the sake of these other things. You have like this idea of like the cold showers. And when you ask people why they take cold showers, it's because they're like, it's good for health reasons. You do meditation now and mindfulness, it's stripped of its Buddhist kind of understanding, but it's now just for well-being. It's a psychological benefit. It has its use. And but then you see how incorporated it can become. You see mindfulness at work, they tell you to practice mindfulness. They give you other tips to, you could say be productive. You can see how the usefulness or the capitalist system is very good at maximizing entropy. Or it can keep maximizing it. Um, And I think that's the problem. It's hard not seeing how it can be undetached from this. Um, and then, I mean, I guess the closest thing that comes to what you might be bringing up is something like religion. That religion did a lot of things that were not necessarily inherently useful. But then we can even look at the I don't know if you like the fascination with Greek culture and like their statues and everything. I don't know if you've like, heard and learned and stuff, but people always talk about how like perfected they did their things. The question that I would ask is, were the Greeks trying to make statues and things and concrete and everything for it to be useful? Or is it precisely because they were fixated on beauty that not even as a society today that we could necessarily replicate what they did? Um, I've always wondered about that specifically, this sort of mysterious element we have with the Egyptians and the pyramids and stuff. I have to wonder whether if it was whether when we interpret these phenomenon, do we interpret in the sense of like, wow, how did they build it? How did they do such a massive feat? What was the use of that? I wonder how much does that skew the interpretation of the fact that maybe they were trying to do something beautiful in excess of. Um, but yeah, I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe just to maybe start that point from, even though you can make all these movies about survival, horror films and so, watching a movie would always remain a activity which will not find immediate use in our lives. It will be
Yeah.
such activities that, we watching a movie will always be something useless. We'll not know why we are doing it. Well, we would be watching a movie at all. Am I right?
Yeah.
We watch movies because there is something, uh, you
Mhm.
know, wrong about watching them. In terms, there's a perverse enjoyment that is there within them. Yeah. Um, this question of what I'm trying to maybe think about is, and I don't want to maybe overstep this because it may get, we get into different terrain.
Mhm.
Now, one is this question that is the opposite of use beauty.
Mm.
Does beauty give us a necessary second option to use? Um, I'm not sure that might be the answer to this question personally. I think beauty as a category does emerge from the contradictions of use, definitely.
Mhm.
But simply striving for beauty,
Mhm.
making beauty the other of use in that sense, might make beauty collapse back into use also. There's something about that question that I'm thinking about. We need to unpack beauty in that sense, and that's the first provocation in that way. Second, let me make a very naive sort of um, very naive argument which people might be making on the other side, people who may listen to this or may be thinking about this, and that argument should be kept on the table first before we do something with it. That argument is that isn't then useless also becoming another form of use?
Yep. Mhm. Mhm.
If
Yep.
you're simply striving for the useless, if you're trying to strive for beauty, aren't we also making it a category of use?
Mhm.
And they're right about it. The joke would become that baldness has also become the hairstyle there. When you're doing it for style and you're doing it for yeah. So you know, how do we think through that question? And it's a
Mhm.
nice question. I not deny that, but that question still becomes important with a discussion like this because it keeps us alert to that useless is not an intentional category. It's not something that we do intentionally, or we'll do something useless. Uselessness emerges from the contradictions of use itself,
Mm.
not from the other of use simply. No, when we are saying that something useless has a value, we are not simply saying that let's pursue useless things as a society.
Mm,
That I think would be slightly,
mhm,
it's showing that even when we are things doing which are of most useful to the society, those things could not have existed had not there been this multitude of useless things which we keep on doing around them to structure those limited things of use.
mhm,
For instance, we all know mathematics is of great use to society. And the mathematician, for him to do mathematics, would be doing thousands of things out of his own interest. Himself within the discourse of mathematics, that he would do something, one thing of use within his career of math, one five things of use in his, isn't it?
mhm,
So it's not an intentional, it's simply a question of intent. It's a genuine question that use itself only pops up, only sustains itself in very limited, much larger space of things, which we characterize as use. We call something as use in that sense. And it's a very difficult problem to within that space to think about, which is why this argument doesn't work. That useless will also become a use. Sure, it will. If you're doing it in that way. The problem is that the same argument can be used the reverse way. Use will also become useless actually
mhm,
in that way.
mhm,
Precisely because using something useful cannot be simply an intentional game. If you're making an intentional game, you can only do so much.
mhm.
You'll only be able to maximize entropy, and within that something can become possible, which is what capitalism struggles with, you fundamentally. That of course you'll be able to meet some immediate needs, immediate ends of yours. So beyond that, you'll not have any visions for long term. So Helen sort of distinguishes between what she calls private and public, and she calls labor and action.
Mhm,
Where labor has immediate ends, action doesn't. If
mhm,
action has immediate ends, you cannot have public sphere inherent. Labor is due to its survival. So if we are only intentionally doing useful things, we can only do labor in inherent words. We cannot act into the world.
That's
For
interesting.
action, something different is required. What about? What role beauty plays into it? What role these other things, a lot of other things play into it. You know, but action cannot be structured only question of survival.
On the question of what?
Sure, survival,
Yeah.
right? Only through questions of use in that sense. Survival becomes a question of use, as you rightly said. When you're
Mhm,
only doing things to use, we are doing things to survive.
mhm, mhm.
Action cannot be contained by that. How do we think through that problem in that way? Yeah.
Mm,
You know?
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I do think this problem, right? This idea that you pointed out, right? The contradiction, well, the argument that could go back and forth, right? Uselessness can become used, but then the we use can become useless. Um, there seems to be a problem of like a structuring, a logic of structuring, that you can actually do both. Um, which is something that I was already that was something that I was seeing because I was like, they can optimize lack. They can do that. They can do that very well. Um, I see it all the time. But that's why it posed a very hard question for me because then it was like, it cannot just be uh, what is useless. Um, and I think you make the other good point about that we don't actually just walk around thinking about what's useless or whatever. We sort of like, so I think this is actually a perfect segue into something that you left on, or I think maybe you were still there in the net session about this idea of habit. Yeah, this idea of habit. And I've been thinking a lot about this, but I don't have a clear answer about this idea of habit. Because, there's the very productive habit that everyone's doing, efficiency, a kind of habits of efficiency, I would say. That's what is being promoted online, right? Like how to read more books, how do you read faster, how can you um, you know enhance your learning and stuff like this. And this is all kind of ideas of efficiency, but as you've been pointing out, this idea of action has no immediate ends. So I wonder if should we start with the problem of boredom instead? Is that the part? Is that the starting point for this question of habit, and then maximizing these kind of actions, and then succumbing to boredom? I think maybe that is one way to begin on this question of boredom, because we do try to avoid boredom, but then we do the very things that you could say are useless, right? Like we watch Netflix, we do a lot of useless things, actually. You could say in the Hannah Arendt sense that we do our labor, right? If I'm just working class, I do my labor, then I come home, I'm tired, and I just want to watch TV and everything. So yeah, um, there's a lack of energy and a lack of time. But then the one thing that I don't want to be is I don't want to be bored after my labor. So, but yeah, I'll see what comes up with me provoking this.
Yeah, so let me ask you this. How do you link boredom with habit for yourself? How do you think about it?
Boredom for myself.
Boredom and habit, where do you see them meeting with each other? That's a very interesting.
I think if I'm just gonna think off the cusp, I mean, I think habit and boredom meet when habit has become maximized, like when habit has exhausted itself, but you don't even realize that it has exhausted itself. It's just the subject says, I don't feel like doing that today. Like that's not what I want to do today. That's what I get from this idea of habit, that the habit comes, and for some reason it is presented, maybe appears as a kind of maximized thing, that today is not the day I want to do that. But then you're trying to find other things to do, but perhaps there is no other habits that you're interested in. Maybe that would be one way to look at it. But yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of look at how habit and boredom meet right now.
Interesting. So, I remember Walter Benjamin having this very interesting essay called Storyteller. If
Hmm.
where he's sort of arguing that, and I'm just talking from memory, it's been long since I've read it. He's arguing that how there's a loss of storytelling because we don't get bored anymore.
Mm.
You know, when if you think about it, boredom is necessary in some senses to uh, uh, to find new stories to tell in that sense to ourselves. Um, if we don't get bored, we also, in some senses, cannot rewrite anything. We can only engage in things that are already written for us. If I
Mm.
put it like, there is no rewriting possible. Rewriting demands this. If you check the text also, and you're writing something, and you have to rewrite it, you have to read your old stuff back. You get bored, you get frustrated, It's only from there that rewriting starts. If you're only sort of engaging in the script that is given to you in life, you can manage it without getting bored to some degree.
Hmm.
It is Boredom is also very psychological problem. why boredom can become so frustrating for some people? What makes boredom such a threat? I know people, for them, getting bored is a point of urgency.
Mm,
It's a point of, what structures boredom in that manner? And let's leave that question for here. That, that I remember as a kid, I used to be like that. My mom, when we used to travel on trains in India, Indian trains were like something at that time. And I would keep on asking her, when will we reach? When will we reach? And I'll keep on adding in between, "Ma'am, I got bored, I got bored, I got bored." Children, you can see there's an urgency around boredom, which is interesting, which needs to be maybe thought through. When
mm,
we are young, many of us show it very, urgency was something to happen.
mm.
And you can think about surprise there, you can think about all of these things, because boredom cannot be overcome simply by calculation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, just parking it over there. On the question of habit, and then we maybe find some kind of a way to think about. Uh, Habits become visible to us only at the point when, in some senses, they are at their worst, if we may put it like that. That is where the challenge of habits become. It's very difficult to see habits otherwise. So its habits automatically become bad habits in that sense,
Mm,
for some reason. If you look at a discourse around habits, habits already presuppose bad habits.
yeah.
What I have been, and habits are always in some senses evoked at the sight of judgment, when we're judging them. So, for instance, our bodies, in some senses, all our bodies have a lot of repetitions that each of us differently, that structures the body. Maybe move, the way we move our hands, the way we see our eyes, the way we look at someone, maybe, the way we touch our face, the way we take a bath, the way we, wash. All of these things are structured through many, many repetitions at the end of it. There's something about habit as a conceptual tool that becomes visible when we find ourselves judging these repetitions,
Mm,
optimizing them, thinking how best we can do with them. Right? What do we may call the threat of skepticism in that sense. There's a judgment that deeply that threatens us around these repetitions, and we start thinking, oh, if we organize these repetitions differently, can we maximize ourselves? So you will find people telling you, oh, sit in the morning for 5 hours, do your studies, you'll crack this. And all of that stuff comes from this idea that repetitions, if we master repetitions in this manner, there is a way of living life possible which is different from your existing self.
mhm,
We can have a and and there is a certain ascent from your everyday that becomes possible by thinking about habits. There's a certain movement out of the everyday. You can
mhm,
fundamentally change yourself. This desire, this fantasy that we harbor, that we can reorder our drives
mhm.
just by habit, that is linked to this problem, that we can restructure not a desire simply. It's not that we're restructuring what we desire, you know, but that is where habit sort of forces us to think about that problem. But underneath that lies the problem of reordering a desire, the drives themselves, the way drives are written on the body.
Mhm,
The challenge for habits has been, and the way I read it in the Wittgenstein and anthropology, has been that, can we find a way to think about habits which is not a question of ascending out of the everyday, moving out of the everyday, finding a space other than that, but through descending into the everyday, but through re-inhabiting the everyday. Not by saying, oh, I want to fundamentally change myself to something else in that sense. but by genuinely inhabiting what I am,
Mm.
what forms of newness emerge from this activity?
Mm.
And this activity, I think, it demands a relationship with boredom, not the
Mm.
other one. Other one can be done without getting bored. Other
Yeah.
one remains interesting to some degree, it remains painful, pleasurable, struggle. This activity, where we are inhabiting the everyday rather than escaping it, I think, also simultaneously deeply spiritual pursuit also. If there
Mhm.
is any kind of spirituality that is left in our modern capitalist times, it has to start and be rooted into this problem of how do you inhabit the everyday.
Mm. Okay. So what I'm gathering is that you're saying with habits that habits presuppose a judgment on bad habits. Like, I think that's very true because the first time somebody wants to introduce a new habit, they have to reveal why the other habits were bad, right? Why you should take a cold shower every day or something like that. Um, but then this presupposes, it's a desire to restructure something. But I think what you're saying is that it doesn't restructure the desire. You're just trying to master repetition. Is that what I'm gathering?
Yeah, I'm saying it, even if it restructures the desire, it
Okay,
is not restructuring your drives in any significant way.
got it, got it. Okay, so the drive is the main point
Drive is the
here.
main point. That is
Main
what
point.
needs to be structured in that sense. Desire is a defense against uh, drive. Desire is a defense against your enjoyment, your deep satisfaction. And we can have a
Is it-
discussion about that.
Okay,
That
it's a
desire
difference. It's a
is a,
difference
is a
between our
defense.
deep enjoyment.
Yeah, it's a defense,
Okay,
not different. It's a defense against any deep satisfaction. Because and
okay, okay. So basically the question is a real existential one, meaning that if we learn to inhabit, the question would be, what could we enjoy, um, versus succumbing to a kind of restructuring of the desire or mastering the repetition. What could we enjoy? That would be the question. That would be the absent question that might be a little bit scary for some people because boredom might be that point of exploring that, of what you could enjoy, or what you could actually find deeply satisfying. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay, so yeah, and yeah, that would be that's the hard selling point, I think. That is
so
the hard
in
selling
psychoanalysis,
point.
you see this, in psychoanalysis, you see something interesting happening. So in therapy, a person will say uh, something that he genuinely finds deep satisfaction in, and immediately go on to hate it also. So for
Mm.
instance, a person can say, I really loved her,
Mm.
but she didn't have a job. Or so what you would do is you simultaneously sabotage your own deep satisfaction to
Mm.
sustain your desire. That's a structure. Desire manifests because you as a subject can, and this is a neurotic subject we're talking about, not the psychotic or the perverse.
Yeah, okay, that's not a
So
problem. Yeah.
yeah, then one should put it out there. Psychotic structure has a very different structuring there. But
Okay.
neurotic subjects essentially, which is what we get structured in these conversations talking about, is a subject whose desire manifests through a fundamental separation and alienation from his own deep satisfaction,
Mm.
from his own that
Okay.
or her own values. You get it?
Yeah.
Why you keep on sabotaging your own um, satisfaction as an obsession or a hysteric in different ways, albeit in different ways. You know?
So
Yeah.
I'm yeah, so this really connects to, I mean, everything that you've been bringing up, meaning like the non-relation, that a lot of these relations are non-relations, and then somehow we've we've mistaken ideal relations as actual relations, and then now from actual relations we've built up habits, because now habits give another form of an ideal relation to which then could restructure our desire, or master repetition, whatever that is. um, and yet we seem to be in all of that. The question that you seem to be pointing at is that we seem to be avoiding something. We seem to be um, we seem to be deferring something. I think this is what's interesting about this, because you basically said, like, lack kind of functions as a kind of almost infinite deferral, right? You never quite, I think the way you phrase it, like you don't quite get to the thing. Um, but what's interesting is that with the way you phrase the way we structure our habits and everything, is that we seem to be deferring the very deep satisfaction itself that we could encounter, um, if if we allowed boredom to inhabit us. I guess you could say, if we allowed boredom to inhabit us, and what would that happen? And actually, I'm trying to think if I do this in my own life, Chetan. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think if I do this in my own life, but I want to say I think I do, because what I discovered is that even though I like philosophy, and I do love philosophy. Actually, you know what? Here's a funny story. I discovered my love for reading philosophy when I was bored. Can you believe that? Like, I discovered that I love philosophy when I was bored, because I was deployed and I couldn't use much of my phone. Yeah, I couldn't use much of my phone when I was deployed, so I had to read. And that's when I discovered philosophy, when I was bored and I had to read something. I had to do something. Um, but I think now, you could say, when I get bored of philosophy, what I like to do is I like conversations. Like, I like having conversations, and I feel like actually that's probably what I enjoy the most. If I'm being honest, I enjoy conversations perhaps even more than philosophy. And I think this is why even I like Plato a bit, because at least Plato is it's all dialogue. It's all it's all in the dialogue. I really love that. That gives me a lot of enjoyment when I read him, and then when I have conversations. But yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think, like, how, if I'm doing it, how did it come about, and how did that already kind of restructure my, you could say, my restructure my drive. You could say in some ways it changed my life, right? Without me having to give a real hard um, structuring of habit, I guess you could say. But yeah, I'll see what comes to mind for you.
Yeah. So, in my own case, I genuinely find, personally, lately, especially past few years, I find it, I find it difficult to just idle, for instance, you know, and I realize that sitting idle is necessary for any creative work that I wish to sort of undertake. Otherwise, my day gets, completely consumed by either, reading that I think is useful, but that to me, or watching some YouTube lectures, or, in that sense. And I have been trying to, in some senses, consciously do activities different from my reading and writing
Mm,
for some part of the day. That helps me, to find the creative engagement back again.
mhm,
Find a certain limit to what I'm doing, to found those boundaries in that sense. And this is where I want to say that boundaries emerge from a certain inhabitation or re-inhabitation of our own habits. Otherwise, certain descent into our habits in that sense. What happens is, if we constantly try and consciously ascent in that sense. If I'm constantly trying to find, say, I'm trying to read something, write something great, or I'll think something. I want to finish this reading today. I am not allowing uh, certain repetitions to find their own anchoring in my own life.
Mm,
I'm before the repetitions get over, I'm trying to change them. That's what happens, you know. And radical newness doesn't come from radical newness comes from radical, in that sense that for radical newness to happen into this world, you have to affirm the repetition.
mhm.
This simple antagonistic relationship with repetitions is a problem. But capitalism also repeats, but it is something new coming into place. You'll go and you buy a new dress from the market. And because you're buying a new dress, you again want to go to the next day. So to find a way forward from repetition is to completely affirm the site of repetitions.
Affirm it.
That is difficult for us.
Okay.
Affirm the site of repetitions, which is what we're discussing with the question of habit.
Okay.
That we have to descend into the repetitions. With radical repetitions comes radical newness, which is why if you go to any therapy, you realize that therapy is not about escaping the symptoms.
Mhm.
Symptoms are site of repetition. If I tell you don't repeat the symptom, you change the symptom, that will not help you. Well, the contradiction which is structuring symptoms still remain over there. One has to allow those repetitions to take place.
Okay.
And it only that happens with time when we start inhabiting the site of a symptom. We
Okay.
start observing, oh, we know I would act this way in this situation. I know I will get anxious. I know I will get scared. I know when this would happen, I would react this way. It's only with this basic first steps that any therapy can do its work upon us.
Mm.
It's not by saying I should not get scared or I should not get anxious.
Uh-huh.
It's by first observing that I will get scared, I will get anxious, that something becomes possible.
Okay. Okay. So let me,
Right?
yeah, let me frame this in the way that maybe I can frame this in my own life, the way you're framing this. Um, so for example, I have this problem where it's a habit, you could say, that I don't really finish most of the books that I read, right? I start reading it and then I'm like, yeah, I'll read something else and I started and then the same thing happens basically. But then I get surprised when I do finish it. Um, so I guess the question is in relation to the way you're framing this is what that I acknowledge that I do this repetition, that I know that I will perhaps go to another book and not finish the other book. Like, but you're saying that acknowledging this, that leaves open the possibility that maybe I finish the book or I discover something else entirely. Um,
I'm
because
saying, yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So I'm saying that I mean, your particular case aside, because I would not know the history and so on and so forth. But let's take this as a symptom,
Yeah,
separate
yeah,
from you. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I'm saying that once if somebody does this, I used to do this a lot. I used to read a lot of books, partially and then leave them. Now I'm the other side. I cannot leave a book half done. It gets frustrating for me. I keep coming back and I prefer that side because I used to enjoy it. I could just move on. So my first few years reading, for a decade of reading, in fact, was like that, where I would read a lot of. But I realized that if I intentionally try and finish those books, I would not have encountered a lot of knowledge that I did by reading them in half or reading them partially.
Okay.
So I started observing myself that what are the patterns through which I leave the books I'm reading.
Mm,
There are certain patterns after which I leave it. Once you start acknowledging and observing your own patterns of reading, that is fun for me. Finishing a book is not for the sake of it.
yeah.
There's a distinct finishing a book becomes this complete idealistic end. if by finishing a book, I'll achieve something which I can't achieve by partially reading it.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes ideal in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And trust me, when I started finishing the books, and there was a point when I could easily finish them also. There's a journey in between where the transition happened where now I could read it very easily. Books I couldn't read before. Uh, I immediately realized that transition was not this great hurrah moment where something radically changed. Some great new knowledge came to me. Now I know how. So, this fantasy that, one of the philosophy professors used to read a lot. Where think, when will I become like him? And I thought, oh,
Yeah.
now I can become like him. That doesn't happen. There is no satisfaction there also. There
Mm.
also you find new repetitions, further repetitions, and so on and so forth. So for me, the question becomes, can you do that activity of your own self? Maybe partially reading a book, it may be some other symptom, whatever it may be. And keep on doing it to the point that it reaches its own end, rather than obstructing it. As neurotic subjects, we will obstruct our own enjoyment. We will do
Yes.
it also, we will enjoy it also, we will keep on saying it to also that oh, we don't read the book completely. As if it's something really terrible happening over there. And
Mm-hmm.
we keep on be getting anxious, and that sustains our desire to read something partially.
Mm.
There
Mm-hmm.
is something interesting happening there at that level that we obstruct the same things that we are deriving some deep satisfaction from.
Okay.
And that sustains the desire. The
Mm.
challenge is not to stop obstructing simply, but to start observing your own patterns in that field as a subject.
Okay.
What are the ways through which we obstruct? you know?
Yeah. Basically, you're saying like, for example, like if I did this with writing. I did this with writing for a very long time, actually. I was very upset that I wasn't like a nice long writer. I could not write very long pieces. And you've read my pieces before. They're actually very short. Like, they're very short. I hated this. I had no satisfaction for this until I noticed that I always make short pieces. This is when I noticed my own behavior on this. And then finally I said, what's wrong with this? I said, what's wrong with this? Um, and then I started enjoying it. I started accepting that, I'm just not, maybe I'm just not, but at the same time, I can't stop. I can't stop not writing short pieces. Um, and it actually fundamentally changed my relationship with writing to become more enjoyable. Now it's funny because now if I like wanted to write something longer, it's super painful for me. It's super painful. So like it changed. It changed in the other direction where I really wanted to write something long, but now if I have to write something long, it's very painful for me. I'm like, I could say this in a couple of paragraphs. Um, so I think there is something to what you're saying about this, and I guess you could say the observation. It seems what you're pointing at is the observation seems to be the de-obstructing, or the possibility of unobstructing what you might be tempted to obstruct. Because if you first notice the habit, you could probably say maybe the refrain is to not obstruct the thing. But the thing is, this I have to talk about this because I think this is a important part of the conversation, is this idea of discipline. That's To me, that's the logic that I feel like that we are fighting against. This idea of discipline, because discipline is already a form of saying that all bad habits are all habits are bad habits unless you have discipline, basically. So when I was doing this writing and reading, my idea was that I lacked discipline, that I did not have the proper structure to do what I needed to do, right? But in this case, would you say that discipline, I mean, I'm not even sure if we understand discipline in the sense that we are talking about, because I'm not even sure if I know what discipline is anymore, because discipline is a kind of repetition, it seems, to get at the ideal, as what you're talking about. That means that discipline is a kind of idealized habit. Would you agree with this? Like discipline, what's your thoughts on discipline for this?
Discipline is like uh, yeah, but discipline, I always remember Foucault's disciplinary power first for some reason. The microphysical power in that sense.
Mhm.
Is it? Where we make incremental changes, such that we, as you rightly said, we can find some ideal um, uh, you know implements from to get certain kinds of output in that. That's the Foucauldian sort of process of that you make incremental changes, small, differentiate. You make the challenge with discipline has always been that can we think about discipline separate from this normalizing force that you're talking about? When you're saying ideal, you mean normalizing force, am I right? A certain normalizing gaze,
Yeah.
which which brings you to certain. I mean, that's what you're trying to say. Foucault's panopticon was a model there. Lacan's question of gaze. I don't want to enter into it too much, but um, that there is something from the other that is watching you. There is an other that just by the fact that we know that there's an other looking at us structures or actions in particular ways.
Okay.
The panopticon model was exactly that. There's a prison over there, a prison in which there's a tower in the center, and there are cells around that tower, and the people living in those cells cannot know whether there's a person in the tower or not. But the very fact that there's a tower over there structures their actions because somebody can be looking at them.
Yeah.
That's the panopticon structure for Foucault.
Hmm.
This normalizing gaze, this normalizing force, where it's not important somebody is actually looking at us, where the very potentiality that we are being looked at
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
structures what we are doing, which is what we're talking about, this question of, threat of skepticism or the judgment that we're talking about. You
Yeah.
know, that is part of the story in the Foucauldian biopolitical, thinking around this problem of
Mhm.
discipline.
Yeah, I think the judgment is a big obstruction to the habit, because when I talk to just people that I am in my life, uh they say something like nobody was around them that day, but they say like, oh, today I felt lazy, I didn't do what I wanted to do, I feel so guilty for not doing what I wanted to do. And this is interesting to me because then what that gaze does, you could say, is that it becomes a gaze of the other within oneself, right? In some ways. That actually what they're saying is that if somebody had saw me, if somebody had seen like what I had wanted to do, they would see that I failed to do that achievement. It's just interesting to me because the way they talk about it is they talk about it from their self-judgment, that I was lazy today and so on. But it's interesting because in that sense, if someone was lazy, um, where are they getting that concept of laziness from? It has to be from some type of normalization of judgment or gaze or something like that. That if somebody had saw me today and what I wanted to do, they would say that I was lazy. And so then it translates into I was lazy today, I didn't do much, I feel bad for myself, so on. It's interesting that they already that the product, they are the judgment and the product of the judgment simultaneously, in this sense, because I would say if you're calling yourself lazy, who saw you? Who saw you to say that you were lazy? Nobody did, but we structure ourselves this way, as if somebody did see us, they would have seen that we were lazy. and did not accomplish what we were meant to accomplish. So I think it seems like there's a lot of barriers there, because now social media and culture is, you could say, everybody's looking for a new judgment, um, a new form of judgment for a habit to form. But it's predicated on that same thing, the fact that there is this fundamental judgment that's presupposing a bad habit.
Absolutely.
And that is something that I don't know if, yeah, I don't know, if because I think it's almost like saying, to say something about this inhabit, to inhabit, is almost as if to say, don't change anything, really. Don't change anything. Don't change anything. Just notice what you're doing, but don't change it. Try not to change it. Because then if you try not to change it, it'll change. It can change, maybe. Or your relationship to it can change. But this is something what I remember the Buddhists kind of taught me when they were like, I was like, I can't let go, and I'm trying to let go, and so on. And then said something like, yeah, but let go of that too. Let go of the fact that you can't let go. It's that kind of observation that you should let go of the fact that you can't do it. Realize that you can't do it. That's your understanding of letting go.
Absolutely. So, coming back to the question of discipline, the question of laziness that you're bringing is a really important point. That if you think about it, that this problem of laziness in discipline is always a question that discipline is as much a struggle with habits.
Yeah.
Discipline is not simply formation of new habits. Discipline is also a constant at war with your own habits.
Yeah.
When we think about discipline in this way,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
am I right? It is always for trying to find a place outside of habit where new habits can be formed.
Mm-hmm.
The existing habits are not useful enough, they are not meaningful enough, so that we can find this, this other place from our habits.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than in inhabiting them, we find this other place. And discipline always gets formed on this side, this other of habits, where new habits can be imagined, where certain blank slate can be achieved and something new can be written
Mm-hmm.
simply without rewriting. Where something fresh can be, tabula rasa, where something fresh can be written for permanence. The fantasy of that is an interesting problem. We can look at the Foucauldian problem of the metaphysics of power there. But there's a fantasy of that in all of us,
Mm-hmm.
where we want discipline to give us that blankness, and that is where I think the Buddhist question come into place. That can you start from what is scribbled on your own body? If you look at the religious, histories of thinking about it, then you'll start thinking around this question of, karma, or, so on and so forth. But essentially, it's a problem of what is written on your own body.
Mm-hmm.
And you start from that side,
Mm.
taking complete responsibility of what is there in that sense, what is written for you. We can be a question of destiny, can be a question of karma, question of dharma, and all of these things sort of start from that perspective, if you're thinking from that, you know,
Yeah, even the idea of
mode.
like original sin, even the idea of like original sin would be something similar to like what you're talking about, right? That I'm
Exactly.
trying, I'm fighting my original sin, to which I have no control over, which I have no control. That's interesting. Okay. Is there any thinker that you think besides Lacan and Hegel? I think you mentioned Hannah Arendt, that could help us in thinking this a little bit more through.
So
Uh,
three thinkers that I really, really love,
mhm,
as much as I love Lacan or any of these thinkers,
uh-huh,
are which I you go back to reading from time to time, which I think have lot to say on what we are discussing. Wittgenstein,
Okay.
you know, is especially Stanley Cavell, philosopher, very important philosopher in that within this space, and his book called The Claims of Reason. It's a very interesting work. And this anthropologist called Veena Das.
Okay.
Um, great work. Veena Das has done a lot of work on everyday and habits. He's written a lot on habits directly. That's something we can, people can look up. Then there's a very interesting new anthropological work that has come in, which I'm like really blown over by. And it's written by the student of Veena Das. It's a person called Pragmatism Singh. He has written this book called Poverty and the Quest for Life.
Mm-hmm.
It's an anthropological work. It's a work done in an Indian village, which is sort of, tangentially dealing with the same questions that we're discussing, the questions of life, habit,
Okay.
what is it to inhabit the everyday?
Okay.
Uh, the- these come to mind definitely on what we are discussing. Apart from this, of course, on the question of entropy, Bernard Stiegler's work is, I think, really, really good.
You say who?
Bernard Stiegler, Bernard, Stiegler. Stiegler.
Oh, okay, got it. Stiegler. Okay.
He just died recently. Committed suicide if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So he has like great. One of his really good books is What Makes Life Worth Living.
Okay.
Great title.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know if I was thinking about like if I were to bring my own thinker that I always love is Martin Buber. But you could say Martin Buber is good in the sense that he made the point that if we only see people as things, and this kind of goes straight into the concept of what we're talking about, is that if you only see people as things, attributes, qualities, and so on, is that you actually obfuscate the very thing of what you and they are. Which actually it's funny because then that means that the people we encounter most of the time are actually in a form of calculation, right? This is what Buber was always pushing against, that we could not calculate the other if we wanted to meet the other. And this is why I actually always liked his work, because it kind of does bode well, except it bodes well in the sense of, I think with people it matters more, his work with people, with meeting people and getting to know people versus reducing them to certain identities, qualities, and attributes. He said that if this is all that we did, then we were missing something. We were going to miss something in this. And so his whole approach was, just basically it had to be a kind of like surrendering a little bit, a letting go. You had to just meet. Like the meeting could not have any intentional purpose. You could not prepare to meet. You could not do nothing like this. It was just meet. And then, you might fail. You might actually encounter something. You might not encounter something. It was not something that was calculated. That was, at least that was very clear with Buber. So in that case, he does add something very interesting there. But yeah, every thinker that you're throwing in there is good. Actually, I wonder what Heidegger would say in this response. But I don't. I mean, I have not much engaged with Heidegger's work, so I don't know. I don't know if you would have a more grasp on Heidegger.
I Heidegger also, in some ways, runs parallel to what we are saying. The only thing with Heidegger, I myself have not had any great engagement with Heidegger personally. To be honest, he never interested me beyond a point. I've tried reading him multiple times, one of those things that you read parts of it and you leave it, part of it and you leave, again encounter somewhere. But thing about Heidegger, at least the way I read Heidegger, is that Heidegger essentially is concerned with the same problems we are having in that sense. The problem which say which concerns the problem of the outside in Heideggerian, um, formalization. The challenge for Heidegger has always been that while he is say maybe diagnosing this problem of totality in Hegel in that sense, this dialectical movement. Heidegger himself is not able to my mind, um, think through the challenge of what says Stanley Cavell called the skepticism, the challenge of judgment.
Hmm.
Heidegger finds a way out too soon from that problem, from the threat of judgment in many ways, which is why
Oh.
Heideggerian thinking will give you, if you will give you certain good answers, but those answers start repeating beyond the point, whether
Hmm.
it's just tell or Heideggerian answers start with way why to start finding certain parallel with fascism and so on and so forth. In that sense. I think if I remember correctly, Zizek had a very interesting critique of Heidegger in his Less Than Nothing. If my memory serves right, and anybody who wants to look it up, you should that
Hmm.
why this problem occurs in Heidegger in that sense, that there's something about Heidegger where you get into his diagnosis of the problem is very, very good. I think we all should read Heidegger because he diagnoses that question very, very uh, uh, accurately. And he also brings to the center problem of language, which is extremely important if you have to think it through, which Hegel doesn't. In Hegel, language is not, which is why Hegel can't think through, say, certain questions, say, which come to the fore in Wittgenstein, Lacan, all of these thinkers. And and Heidegger also language becomes very important. Language becomes this thing and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Um, but he's not able to, in some senses, to my mind. And as I said, I've read very little of Heidegger because I never get interested in him beyond a point. But I do think that whenever I start reading him, I get really interested, and then I sort of slowly start losing my interest. Because I personally find within myself that his frame becomes such where, certain easy answers become possible. There, I think your
Mm,
negative pragmatism can do lot of good. With negative pragmatism, there's no easy answers possible in that sense. You need to go to the end of that.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I don't know why I stopped reading Heidegger, but I always come back to him here and there, and I drop him, and I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, I get interested in him a lot, and then I stop. Um, yeah. But okay. I think this is a good stopping point about repetition, entropy. We covered a lot. Um, I'm probably going to use this to write a piece, to write a piece to compile everything of what we just said, because I think it'll be good for the conversation moving forward with everybody.
I'd
Um,
love to read it.
yeah, because I mean, I think what you said and what you pointed out, I think it's like some of the things that you were probably not able to quite bring out on the net session. There's just not enough time. There's not enough one-on-one conversation to really bring it out. So I think everything you said really like brought it out, and that's why I've been trying to get everybody kind of one-on-one a little bit, so that way I could just start compiling and see what's going on. But you pointed out very good points. The problem of boredom. Instead of habits, can we inhabit in ourselves? Is that possible? How would we do that? Um, is this problem of judgment? I think that's to me the biggest problem. This problem of judgment, and what seems to get in the way of this happening. Um, because I guess you could say when we observe, we judge. Like when we observe, we're judging. So like this is the problem that we're already encountering with the idea of, if I'm looking at my symptom, I'm already judging my symptom, and I'm already tempted to change my symptom, rather than to let it go. And I think, just to finally sum it up, I think what you got at with, we could discover a deep enjoyment I think it's precisely this. I think we get close to a kind of deep enjoyment, but then, either through culture or the other, or the judgment in ourselves, we end up deferring that enjoyment and trying to construct a new habit, and then we fall back on the same trajectory because it's precisely in our body that it's continuing to go, that we either consider ourselves as failures or something of that sort, which is interesting. It's interesting that failure is such a negative connotation, and that failure can only be a provisional state, meaning you fail to then succeed. But what if we rephrase this idea into, you fail, like you do your symptom until it fails, rather than you saying that you're a failure. You follow and observe your symptom till it fails, and then you can maybe go into a new repetition. I don't know what you think about that. Yeah, you're nodding. I don't know.
Well, I understand. I agree in that sense that
Okay.
failure is something which is extremely. We don't realize that once we make failure a bad thing in itself, how much of our potential gets lost because we do not have a relationship with our own failures. And we're living in a society where failure becomes the defining feature of a human characteristic in our times. The challenge becomes that how do you start looking at yourself not simply through failures, but what you did with them in that sense?
Hmm.
That switch
Yeah.
where how do we start thinking about subjectivity, identity beyond the markings of the failure? So it's a very interesting and a very deep problem because we keep on saying that we need to accept our failures. We all say that you know
Yeah.
as a form of discourse. We recognize that that kind of a line is extremely important. But the question of judgment, where as we are saying, doesn't allow us to um, come to terms with in some senses, or give us a language to our failures in that sense.
Hmm.
Uh, and there's something about that question, and just maybe finish it. The question of skepticism that we are saying, the challenge of skepticism is not to go beyond judgment. I think as philosophers, as thinkers, we need skepticism to walk alongside us at all points of time. The
Yeah.
challenge is that it should not become the only thing in the room that dominates all other forms of
Yeah.
experience and
Mhm.
so on and
Exactly.
so forth.
That's
Right?
right. Hmm.
Absolutely right that the question of judgment and failure is like deeply linked with in that sense.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good stopping point. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching, and thank you, Chetan, for being here with me today to talk about this. I think we made some, I think we started some good starting points, and then we've revealed some new problems to have to deal with and talk about more. But this is good. This is good. I like this. All right. Thank you
Thank
guys for watching.